presenters are very, very precious to me. My daughter and my son-in-law, who is like a son also, are here to enhance our afternoon. So let me introduce Dr. Komrad. Recipient of the National Exemplary Psychiatrist Award and named Mental Health Professional of the Year by the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, Dr. Komrad is a psychiatrist on the teaching faculty of Johns Hopkins, University of Maryland, and Tulane. In addition to a private practice in psychiatry, he is active as a medical ethicist and lectures worldwide on issues in psychiatric ethics. Dr. Komrad widely educates the public about mental illness and what psychiatrists do on TV, radio, and speaking to groups across the country. For many years, he was the host of Komrad on Call, a nationally syndicated weekly radio call-in talk show about psychiatry. He has consulted on the development of major Hollywood films to ensure more accurate portrayals of psychiatrists in the movies. Dr. Komrad's book, You Need Help, a step-by-step guide to convince a loved one to get counseling, grew out of his radio show and his years of experience consulting to families about how to persuade troubled relatives and friends to get psychiatric help. It is my honor and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Mark Komrad.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So first of all, I want to apologize for the little extra delay, but thank goodness we have a 25-year-old in the family because we had a lot of technical difficulties. And I will tell you, everybody is in their own wheelhouse, feels like confident in their wheelhouse, but not in anybody else's. And I will tell you that I find it a lot easier to treat people with severe mental illness than I do how to figure this stuff out. That's one of the many reasons I needed to have a son. So thank you all so much for joining us today. And my job this afternoon is to try to help you with something that's very specific. There's a lot of talk about the need for mental health treatment and the value of getting people that treatment. But unfortunately, unlike, say, for example, orthopedics or urology, it's just not that easy to convince people to get state-of-the-art mental health treatment. If your knee is swollen, most people aren't reluctant at all to come to see an orthopedic. But troubled people, people who are in pain and agony, who feel all variety of problems in mental life, however, are much less likely to be willing to see the likes of me or similar colleagues. So that's why I really call this talk the tough first step, because no matter what kind of access you might have or what kind of resources might be available, actually convincing somebody to get in the door is sometimes extremely challenging. And I want to address that with you today, but first I want to talk a little bit about some background about mental illness in general, and I want to also speak a little bit about some of the various reasons why people might be reluctant to come in to get the help that they need. So the fact is that mental disorders are very common. You even see a typo right there. 1 in 4 have some type of mental disorder. If you take all people in the United States, really, 1 out of 4, 25% of people will have some kind of clinically significant psychiatric problem. If you look at just young people, ages 18 to 25, 1 in 3 have a mental illness of some sort within the past year. And unfortunately, of all the different sectors of the population, that age group has the lowest rate of any treatment, even though they may have the highest rate of problems. If you look at everybody over age 18, over 12 million people have had serious thoughts of suicide in the last year. And just last year in 2022, there were 45,000 suicides in this country, which is a higher level than it's been any time in the last 4 years. Unfortunately, the problem even extends to our young people. The Surgeon General's report, looking at the last 12 years up till 2021, turns out that suicide has become the second leading cause of death among children, second only to car accidents, which is the leading cause. So the number 2 cause of death in people under age 17 is suicide. And also in that period, there's been a 57% increase in suicide attempts among youth. But as I said, reluctance to seek treatment is extremely common. So the question is, who can help them? And my answer to that is you, particularly loved ones. And my point this afternoon is going to be that really the power to convince people to get the help that they need lies not so much in the hands of police, not so much in the hands of doctors or emergency rooms. The most significant power, the often untapped power, lies in the loved ones, the family members of those who are worried about their loved ones who are troubled. So it's interesting when a number of surveys have been done asking, look, if you had an emotional or mental problem, who would you be most likely to turn to? And it turns out that people are most likely to turn to family or friends rather than healthcare professionals. However, as you see, 1 in 5 actually said, I won't turn to anybody. I don't want anybody's help. If I was emotionally troubled, leave me alone. So again, even an unwillingness to turn to family or friends is common. There we go. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about why it's important to help, why take this seriously, what's at stake here. So first, I want to just talk about some common consequences that come up. So Freud was actually the first one who came up with a reasonably working definition of what mental health is. And Freud said that mental health is simply the ability to love and work effectively. So in those 2 domains, love, namely relationships, whether they're family relationships, love relationships, or friendships, and in order to be able to do something productive in the world. So those are the 2 domains in which we have to look. So as a result, some of the common consequences of mental disorders are affecting relationships with family and friends, creating problems like breakups, divorce, parental alienation syndromes, friends that amputate from other friends. And in the world of work, of course, underfunctioning in work or actual loss of a job, dropping out of school, not at all uncommon among young people, or the development of disability and having disability payments. It turns out that mental disorders cause more lost days of work than heart problems, lung problems, and joint problems, rheumatologic problems combined. If you combine heart, lung, and joints, it's even not equal to the number of lost days at work that mental disorders cause. And of course, tremendous financial instability by the virtue of the fact that people are not able to work in any kind of a sustained and secure way. Also, mental disorders take a significant toll on physical health. Because remember, the mind and the body are connected with one another, and the energy and effects flow both ways. This is one particular demonstration of that, and that is in this one study, you can see the depression rating scales. As you go to the right, those are higher and higher scores on a depression scale. So as you go to the right, people are more and more depressed. As you go up, that is a measure of the likelihood of dying within 5 years of having a heart attack. So the more depressed you are, the more likely you are to die within 5 years after a heart attack. So it makes a significant difference in prognosis, mental health, in a recovery from something as physical as a myocardial infarction. And as a matter of fact, the highest, people with the most depression are 7 times more likely to die within 5 years after a heart attack than those without depression. So again, the mind and body become more than the sum of the parts. All right, now I want to also touch in this day and age on some uncommon consequences, but in many ways more dire, because there's so much in the news these days about mass shootings and school shootings and so forth. And obviously those kinds of things are tied in with mental disorders, and I want to educate you in that regard in a couple of ways. So first of all, there is actually a link between mass shootings and mental illness. So this one study looked at mass shootings between 1900 and 2017. And it turned out 57% of those mass shootings were carried out by people who either had been diagnosed with a mental disorder or demonstrated signs of a serious mental illness prior to the attack. And if we take a look at all people who've committed mass murder, they're nearly 20 times more likely to have had a severe mental illness than the general population. What's interesting is not 100%, right? You might think, gee, anybody who commits a mass murder must be crazy, that they must be mentally ill. In fact, that's not true, and perhaps another time I'll come back and give a talk to you about the distinction between evil and mental illness. They have certain overlaps in the Venn diagram, but they are not identical. People can be bad without being mad. Not all mad people are bad, and not all bad people are mad. As a matter of fact, yes, that's all true, the statistics I show you, but first of all, remember, mass murder is a very tiny fraction of violence and murder in particular in the U.S. Certainly makes the headlines, but actually, if you look at all violent deaths in this country, it's almost zero as a percentage. Secondly, most acts of violence, 97%, are actually committed by individuals who do not have a mental illness. So again, bad is not the same as mad. And finally, most people with mental illness do not commit any violence. In fact, if you want to look at what percentage of people with various mental illnesses commit violence, under 4%. So most people with mentally ill are not violent people, are not people to be afraid of. But the headlines, because mass murder makes headlines and because 59% of mass murderers do have a mental disorder, the public often conflates the two, and it makes people all the more afraid, as if we didn't have enough stigma about mental disorders to begin with. All right, now I want to talk about the real story when it comes to violence and mental illness. It is not, at least really statistically significant, and most, to me as a psychiatrist, in my wheelhouse, the most important story is not homicide, it is suicide. Because if you want to talk violence and mental illness, it's violence against the self that's the big issue. So I don't know if you can see that with the washout on the screen, but this shows the increase in the suicide rates across the nation. The darker the blue, the higher the rate of increase has been since 1999. So suicide rates have increased in 49 out of the 50 states since then, with one exception, which is Nevada, which is a mystery to me, but maybe there's something to being able to blow off all that steam in Las Vegas. So somehow Las Vegas has been inoculated against this, and I think therein lies a good graduate school study. Suicides went up more than 30% in half the states. In the most significant was in Montana, by the way, the state with the highest level of gun ownership. 56% increase in suicides there. However, this is quite significant and really pertinent to our topic today, is that a little over half of the suicides that happen in this country, those people had never been evaluated and never seen a mental health professional prior to their suicide. So the fact is that at least half of these suicides were people who were untreated, who've never been treated. The situation is especially bad among active military. If you look at active military people between ages 18 and 44, In 2019, 1 out of every 10 active duty military personnel made a suicide attempt. 1 out of every 10. Imagine this was a room full of soldiers of all the branches, and you look around the room, 1 out of 10 people in this room would have attempted suicide in 2019. And children, particularly ages 10 to 12, in just those 20 years, there's been a 500%, a five-fold increase in successful, completed suicides among those children. And the rates among black children are 3 times higher than among white children when you compare the two. All right, in this day and age in the United States, we need to talk about guns. And we need to talk about guns' relationship to our topic. And of course, it's Florida, so we especially need to talk about guns here. And the story that I want to tell you as a psychiatrist about guns is not the story of homicide, it is the story of suicide. Because in my department, guns are an instrument of suicide. And I'm going to show you that nationwide, that's a much bigger story than guns and homicide, although not one that the press pays a lot of attention to. Because if you look here, over the course of years, the rates of suicides, the rates of deaths from firearms are much higher when it comes to suicide than homicide. Suicide by gun is more common, way more common, than homicide by gun. So one of the important things is that when you think about the various methods that people use to try and take their lives, such as cutting themselves, overdosing, hanging, most methods are rather, thank goodness though, ineffective. However, when people attempt to commit suicide by gun, they're successful almost 90% of the time by comparison, which is very important, and it happens very quickly, which is actually one of the reasons why we psychiatrists are especially concerned about people having very quick access to guns when they're in distress, going out and being able to get a gun, not having any waiting period, is actually especially precarious, because a waiting period is really necessary, because when you try to go out and get a gun and use it to try to kill yourself, you're very, very likely to be successful. So that's why a cooling off period is especially favored by psychiatrists. And by the way, just to let you know, when I'm treating any patient who is depressed, I always ask, is there a gun in the home? And if there is a gun in the home, I ask that the gun be removed until the treatment is successful. And oftentimes I will have to ask, to speak to another member of the family, so another member of the family can remove the gun and take it over to a friend's house. Because if you want to engage in effective suicide prevention, the single most important thing that can prevent suicides in this country is dealing with this issue of guns and the rapidity of access to them and who has them. So in 2021, if you look at all the suicides, nearly 43,000 suicides, over half of the suicides were by gun. Over half the suicides were by firearm. If you start in any one year and you track and you take a population, a group of people who don't own a gun and the people who just go out and buy a gun for the first time, and you track cumulatively the chance of killing themselves, the number of people who kill themselves in the orange, where the gun owners, rises quickly and then continues to rise and stays way above the likelihood of a suicide from non-gun owners. So in fact, gun owners are 4 times more likely to die by suicide unless the gun owner is a woman. If the gun owner is a woman, she is 35 times more likely to die by suicide using a gun. 35 times more likely. Suicide is 4 times as likely in members of a gun-owning home, not the owner themselves, but a spouse or a child or someone else in the home, compared to homes that don't own a gun. And if you look at youth, young people who die by self-inflicted gunshot, suicide, 75% of them, where do they get the gun? It's their parents' gun, typically not properly stored. Here's the take-home from this section of my talk this afternoon. If you look at every human being in this country who dies by a gun, it's 2 out of 3 have their own finger on the trigger. 2 out of 3 of every gun death in America is a suicide, not a homicide. So that's why in my particular world, this is the story about guns and violence. Suicides are a third more likely than homicides when it comes to guns. All right, so let me then progress on to now dive into our topic, and let me give you some background as to where it emerged in my life. So this is Fraser, some of you may recognize. So there was a time that I was Fraser. In the late 90s and early 2000s, I had a radio show that went coast to coast. 43 million listeners. It was live 2 nights a week, and it was a call-in radio program, Talk to the Psychiatrist. It was actually called Komrad on Call, and it broadcast on the American Radio Network. So I had 2 hours each time. So 1 hour I would interview a guest, a colleague, about some specific topic like anxiety or depression or PTSD. And then the other hour was always open phones, which is always the most popular hour, where people ask me anything you've ever wanted to ask a psychiatrist but never had the time. So a very common question that I would get on the show is my father, my sister, my grandfather, my brother, somebody I care about is having some kind of emotional trouble that's beyond my ability and know-how to help them. How can I convince them to see the likes of you, somebody like you, to get professional help? So I would brainstorm with people on the air about what have they tried, what have they not tried, what kinds of different approaches you might take. And as a result of that, I actually developed a specialty in psychiatry of helping counsel people about how to convince and work with a loved one to get counseling. And I did that both for my own patients who often had a relative, and they were trying to convince the relative to get a bite of the same apple of treatment that my patient was getting from me. But often people have come from all over the world, as a matter of fact, because of this radio show to consult me about a loved one. So after 20 years of doing that work, I put everything that I learned into this book. You Need Help, a step-by-step plan to convince a loved one to get counseling. And I actually brought some books today, and if you're interested, the synagogue here, actually the Tree of Life, both sides are selling it afterwards. All proceeds, I'm donating the books, all proceeds to the institution here. And I happen to know the author, so I can get it signed for you as well. Well, if you look at all the different chapters, I'm not going to go through what all the different chapters are, but the longest chapter is why mental illness goes untreated. Why do you need a book like this? Why do you need a book about how to convince somebody to get psychiatric, psychological, mental health help? We don't need a lot of books convincing people to go to a cardiologist or convincing people to go to a urologist or a GYN. Why do we need a book to convince people? Where there are many, many reasons, and I'm not going to recapitulate the whole chapter for you, but there are a few important things that I just want to touch on. So why don't people actually get help? Why do they need you, their loved ones, to do this? Well, sorry, moving a little faster than me. So the chief and foremost is the age-old fear about people who are crazy, right? A fear which, by the way, Hollywood loves to capitalize on. You heard that I've done some consulting to Hollywood, trying to help get perhaps more accurate portrayals, not just of the mentally ill, but also the people who treat them, because Hollywood loves to distort guys like me think Hannibal Lecter, right? So we get what Irving Goffman called the courtesy stigma, right? The courtesy, from our patients, they're stigmatized, and since we're with them, we get we live in this shadow of that stigma. So psychiatrists, too, happen to also be stigmatized, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why, at least in my generation, it's changing now, thank goodness. If you were the top of your medical class and you wanted to be a doctor, you wouldn't choose psychiatry because they're not real doctors. So we actually had a lot of difficulty in my era recruiting people into psychiatry. It's now becoming an increasingly popular field for reasons we can talk about. It's quite interesting. But the fact is, stigma applies to those who are mentally ill as well as to those who treat them. Here I have an illustration of something you can buy on Amazon, I guess for a Halloween costume. Women's crazy psych ward patient wrapped up dress costume. So you can actually get a sexy straitjacket, right? Because, that's just crazy. All right, so there's stigma, and one of the earliest voices against stigma that I love is Abraham Lincoln, who himself suffered from depression and famously wrote in a letter, a tendency to melancholy is a misfortune, not a fault. I love that. A very modern voice against stigma, has written a number of books, is Rosalind Carter. So I think you've all heard that Jimmy is now in hospice. So Rosalind and I know each other, and she was she's written a number of wonderful books to try to destigmatize mental illness, and the Carter Center has a whole program that I've participated in for some years about how to help to advocate for more mental health resources and less stigma and so forth. And so Mrs. Carter was kind enough to write the foreword to my book, but she's been a great warrior against stigma. All right, so another reason why people don't go for help. I call it the Nike Nation myth, right? Nike, just do it. Just do it, right? We really celebrate and we vaunt autonomy and self-determination. I mean, that is the American ideal, right? Not just individualism, but the power of the individual. However, the fact of the matter is that we, as human beings, we may want to aspire to the fullest autonomy and complete independence and the exercise of the all-powerful free will, but the fact is that there are conditions that actually impair our will, right? Probably we've all experienced to some extent whether we've been physically ill or intoxicated, but mental disorders, particularly the serious mental disorders, absolutely compromise free will. But that's a scary thing. It's part of the stigma, as a matter of fact, that we have ways in which we can actually malfunction that affect the very thing that makes us most human, which is our reason and our will. By the way, one of the reasons I went into psychiatry was because I found that psychiatry, of all the specialties in medicine, was the least veterinary specialty. In other words, it has to do with the essence of what it means to be a human being, namely the mind, the soul, the mental life of human beings, whereas I found all the other specialties like orthopedics and pediatrics and so forth to basically have, much in common with veterinary medicine. But the mind is something that is uniquely human, and it's one of the most significant aspects of what attracted me to this field. So dealing with the impairment of mental life, dealing with the impairment in free will and autonomy and self-determination is the essence of what we deal with when it comes to mental disorders. By the way, it was this myth that catalyzed, it was Nancy Reagan's campaign to just say no to drugs. Just say no. Of course, the operative word there is just. You may think the operative word is no, but for me, the operative word is just. That's all it is. Just say no. Just say no, because all you got to do is deploy your free will, and you're done. You ought to be unlimited in power, just mobilize it. So that was really a misguided thing. Now, another reason is the nature of certain illnesses, particularly the severe ones like schizophrenia and active depression or mania. They actually have a curious feature to them. And that curious feature is that people cannot see that they're ill. They cannot see that they're ill. They lack insight into it. I mean, you would think, right, if you heard the Ark talking to you, maybe that's not a good example because this is a religious institution, okay? All right. Imagine being at home and hearing your clock on the wall talking to you, right? You would think if you heard that, you would say, that's not right. You know, it's kind of like you would think, I have a ringing in my ear. I should see somebody about that, right? Something wrong with my ear. I should go get that checked out, right? But people with severe mental illnesses who have, say, auditory hallucinations, or they think the television is talking to them, not an unusual symptom at all, you would think they would say, that's not right. I should get that checked out. No. They do not see that as in any way abnormal. They lack insight into that. In fact, if you tell them, look, I think there may be something wrong with you, you might need to get some help, they're going to say, you're part of it. You're part of it. You've helped arrange for the television to talk to me. You put a microphone in that clock. So there's a fancy Greek word for this, too many letters for Scrabble, called anosagnosia, which literally means they don't know that they don't know. Anosagnosia, very common in about 80% of people with, again, serious mental illnesses like schizophrenia, and actually one of the bane of both families and psychiatrists who are trying to help these people because they don't think they're sick. By the way, this is a wonderful book, kind of a counterpart to my book by Javier Amador called I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. See, my book is You Need Help. His is I'm Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. Kind of the two bookends there. And this is all about how to deal with this issue in your loved one. Then there is this is misinformation, where Tom Cruise, who is the archetype of misinformation when it comes to the treatment of mental illness, says, here's the thing you have to understand with psychiatry. There's no science behind it, and to pretend that there is a science behind it is criminal. Let me tell you that I could give you a whole other lecture about the state of the art of neuroscience and how it relates to what we know about mental life and our treatments. But the fact of the matter is, again, this is part of the stigma against psychiatry, psychiatrists, and in company, the mentally ill, right, is that people really have, well, look, in a way, when I gave this talk, when I started giving this talk, my book is now 10 years old. When I first sort of started to go around talking about this book, misinformation was a spooky and uncommon thing that, most people didn't understand. Who would have predicted that 10 years later that we would be living in the heart of the age of misinformation, with which we're all familiar with in so many different domains. Now psychiatry is just yet another in the vast sea of misinformation that we live in. But that's a big issue. Manpower shortage. The fact of the matter is, it's hard to get an appointment. It is hard to get an appointment. You want to see me as a psychiatrist? 6 to 8 week wait, right? Why? Because it's not enough of us, or even our related mental health professionals. If you look at every U.S. county, 55% of all counties in the United States have 0 psychiatrists. 0, right? The rest have at least 1, if not more. 4,000 counties have 1 psychiatrist for every 30,000 people. So there is, and we can talk about, if you want afterwards to come up, those who want to chat some more, we can talk about the many, they're complicated, numerous reasons why this is the case. some of it has to do with this, and that is finances, right? Is insurance coverage and the cost of this. So SAMHSA, the national government organization that looks after mental health and drug abuse, does an annual report. So they asked people, and the latest, which is 2020, if you needed mental health help and didn't get it, why? Why didn't you get it, okay? And the answer is, the number one answer, you can't see it here, but almost 45% of people said, I can't afford it. I just can't afford it. In fact, the second most reason, which is might cause my neighbors or community to have a negative opinion of me, stigma, only 14%. So way down, lower than I can't afford the cost. So that actually makes me want to remind you that one of the most important things from my point of view as a psychiatrist of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, is it made parity the law of the land. What is parity? Parity means that an insurance company must cover mental illness treatment identical to how it covers any other treatment. So if you go to the dermatologist, and the dermatologist it has 80% of his or her fee covered, you can't go down the hall to the psychiatrist and have only 50% covered, which is the way it was, ever since I was a med student. Most insurance has only covered 50% of the cost, and also had a lifetime cap on the amount that you could spend that it would cover on mental illness, but not for anything else, right? So, tremendous injustice. So, lack of parity, that was, as far as psychiatrists are concerned, that was the great innovation of the Affordable Care Act, is that it has to be the same. However, how well is that working out? Well, here, this map shows you the grades for each state. And red is an F, and orange is a D, and yellow is a C. So you see, it ain't working out so well in the actual practice, which means all these states have to be brought to court and sued to be able to actually obey the law. With one exception, and that's Illinois. I guess there's something magical about Chicago, perhaps, where they're very enlightened there, but Illinois seems to be, in this particular regard, the most law-abiding state, where they have a ranking of A when it comes to mental health parity. But this obviously feeds into the finance issue. All right, now let's dive in a little bit, and I'm just going to touch on a few things. I did actually devote 364 pages to this topic, but I'll just extract a couple of points for you for this afternoon about when you're working with somebody that you love to be able to get them into treatment. Now, the goal of treatment is an evaluation. That's what my book is about, is just getting them in the door to try to find out the answer to the question, what's going on here? And we call that diagnosis. And a lot of people say all these negative things, diagnosis, labeling, and so forth. But one of the things that we know in medicine, okay, diagnosis is a very important starting point. Why? Because based on that diagnosis, you can dip into all we've learned from science and epidemiology and treatment trials and so forth to be able to say, what are we going to do about it? What are our resources? So diagnosis is critical for therapeutics, and diagnosis is very important because it allows you to tell people what we can say with some reasonable degree of certainty. What's going to happen if you don't treat it? What's going to happen if you do treat it, right? And that's very important. It gives not a perfect, but it gives some ability to predict the future in either of those two paths. So from the point of view of an evaluation, diagnosis is not a label. It's done very carefully and very thoughtfully. It may change over time, but it's critical in order to know how to proceed. All right, so when you want to talk with somebody who is having distress, What kind of distress? Perhaps they haven't gotten out of bed for days. Perhaps they're so anxious that they haven't gone to work. Perhaps they're having terrible nightmares. Perhaps they're standing at the sink washing the dish over and over and over again in a certain way for 45 minutes before they can move on. Whatever is the problem, question is, how do you proceed with opening the conversation? Well, first is picking the right time and place. So I have sort of these two categories, things you shouldn't do, wrong time and place, and the right time and place. So first, the don'ts, okay? Not in the middle of the night, okay? People are not fully able to be online with their mentation if it's in the middle, and the later it gets, people are tired, people are restless, not the middle of the night. Not when anyone's intoxicated, which is often when stuff tends to spill out, that you wanted to say you've been restraining, whether it's you, the helper, who's intoxicated, or the person who needs help. Not at special occasions and family events. You know, when people gather together in families, everybody's trying to, you know, make an impression. There's old dynamics that are happening. People are very sensitive at that time to their image and what people are saying. You know, weddings, funerals, that is not a good time to initiate this conversation. While arguing, or right after an argument, you know, when you argue, the limbic system in the brain, which is the part of the brain that controls flight and fight and freeze, stays activated actually up to a couple of hours after you stop arguing, right? So you can easily kind of flare it up again because the coals haven't died down. So avoid doing it in arguments. And of course, this is not a conversation to have through the indirect communications of email and texts and phones and Facebook and all the various ways that the younger generation prefers to communicate. But I'm not looking in that direction. So, do's. It's very valuable to actually prepare the way, to not spring it on someone. To say, look, there's something really important I want to talk to you about, but don't be afraid. Nothing, you know, bad. Don't have to prepare for anything catastrophic, but something we need to have a serious conversation to set up the expectation set. You know, so Wednesday, can I come over? And have a person actually have some anticipation. That actually works, especially if you smooth it out. Also, to say, look, what I'd like for you to be able to do is I'd like for you to be able to listen to me before you respond, and I'd like for you to take me seriously, because this is a serious conversation that we're going to have. It's important to find a place that's emotionally neutral, not up in your old childhood bedroom together with your sibling. Probably not in the family home. It's someplace that isn't evocative with all sorts of potentially traumatic memories. And if it feels like there may be some unsafe blowback, maybe a semi-public place like a park bench, rather than closed off in a room. So we want it to look like the left, not the right, when we have this conversation. And remember, the goal is to be able to get an evaluation. That's your only goal, not keep going in treatment, not right now, or take your medicine, not right now. It's getting an answer to the question, how do we understand what's going on? So here are some basic tips for that conversation. First, I think it's important to accept yourselves and ask the person, that your loved one, to accept that, yeah, this is uncomfortable. I absolutely acknowledge this is not easy, this is not comfortable, but it is important. And in fact, but the most important thing for me in this conversation is our relationship. Okay? I am approaching you because our relationship matters to me. And my concern and love about you is the essence of our relationship, and it's to honor our relationship that we're having this conversation, and that our relationship is that of love and concern. See, this is what makes you all different than me. My relationship with any troubled person who's having a problem in mental life the point of departure is not love, although I do love all my patients, but not in that way, right? Not with the power of the relationship that you all have with loved ones. So to be able to say, this is something that I'm speaking to you out of love, all right? And I have some other feelings too that is driving this conversation. I'm worried about you. I feel somewhat helpless to know what to do. I don't know what to do for you. You haven't been to work in 2 weeks. I don't know what to do to help you. So acknowledging your own helplessness and the need for some kind of help to transcend that helplessness. Now, what you want to do is you want to describe the specific behaviors, the not getting out of bed for several days, the shower that goes on for 4 hours, the way in which he falls asleep every night on the couch because of drinking, right? You don't want to give a diagnosis. You don't want to say, I think you're an alcoholic. I think you have OCD. I think you're depressed. It is not your job to come up with that conclusion. It is not that's the job of the evaluator, right? Your job is, because it could be, I mean, the fascinating thing in medicine in general, psychiatry as well, is what we call differential diagnosis. What's differential diagnosis? And that is something can be part of many, many different syndromes. Think of a cough, right? A cough could be an allergy. It could be bronchitis. It could be pneumonia. It could be a smoker's cough. It could be lung cancer, right? It could be pleurisy. So the differential diagnosis, which of those, and you ask a whole bunch of questions, you sort it out, maybe you do some tests, and then you try to tease out what it is and what it isn't. So that's the job in evaluation, is to go through that. That is not your job as the helper. Your job is to focus specifically on the behavior and to avoid buzzwords like crazy, you're crazy, or you're sick, or this is really abnormal, okay? So those kinds of editorial buzzwords, absolutely that can shut somebody down immediately. Be prepared for the fact that it may not go as well as you want. Be prepared that they may get upset. They may get angry. And you have to be prepared to that without getting defensive. So you have to absolutely need to anticipate that and be prepared to say, to empathize with that. I know this is hard for you. To decode the anger instead as anxiety. I know getting this kind of help is something that, requires some courage and some vulnerability. Sometimes I've found it very helpful for people to frame it as a gift. Listen, we have our wedding anniversary coming up, and there's something I would like for our anniversary, and it's something you cannot buy in any store, and it's more precious than rubies. The gift I'd like from you is to let me go with you, to sit with a professional, to try to find out how to understand the behavior XYZ that we talked about, not your depression or your OCD, right? And if you're in treatment yourself or have been in treatment yourself, this is a really good time to share the benefit that you have. And again, it may not happen the first try. When I counsel families who have tried, typically by the time somebody gets to me, they've already been through this, an attempt. And the most common mistake is we had one conversation and it didn't go well, so we stopped, right? So one has to actually have somewhat of an iterative process with this. I don't know if this is going to play. My videos are not playing because of the technical problem. But that was Julie Andrews talking about her treatment and how another person who got treatment influenced her. All right, so you want to pitch a one-time evaluation. That's all, just pitch just once, okay? It's the job of the evaluator to, if they need ongoing treatment, to try to convince the person to stay in ongoing treatment. Offer to make the appointment, offer to pay. So they'd said, well, I can't afford it, or prepay. And ask if you could go along just to sit in the waiting room. Now, it's very important that sometimes you need allies, and it takes many people to help people over the finish line. And who are some of the allies that you can work with? Siblings and family members, the primary care person, the family doctor, clergy, employers, coaches, peer supporters. It's very valuable. Many people go to a support group, like the National Alliance on Mental Illness runs support groups for families that are struggling with people who have mental illness. And there's a lot of wisdom in those rooms, and they can help you about how to approach. If you are seeing a mental health professional, get some guidance from your own mental health professionals or your primary care provider. It's interesting, again, when you ask people who would you most likely to seek help from, family and friends are first, as we said, but second is the primary care physician. And that's a very, very good resource because it works. In this one study in 2019, it's found out that the degree to which men were likely to get help, men, difficult audience there for this goal, are more likely to get help for their mental health if they have a good relationship with their family physician. All right? And the fact of the matter is that mental health professionals are not that numerous. 80% of all mental health treatment is actually done by primary care. 80% of medications, like antidepressants, because there's just not enough psychiatrists to go around. All right, now, you may get to the point where it is just not working. Why? Because there may be diminished capacity, diminished reason, and that you may need to resort to stronger measures, which I am not embarrassed to call coercion. Call it caring coercion, therapeutic coercion, tough love, all right? The fact of the matter is that in order to persuade somebody to do something, you need them to have the capacity for reason, right? But mental disorders sometimes diminish reason. So persuasion is not going to be effective and needs to be replaced with coercion. And the goal of that coercion is to restore reason, to get people back into treatment, to restore their capacity for reason through treatment. As Hamlet says, diseases desperate grown by desperate appliance are relieved. So what this means is that we have to shift the conversation in that setting from rights, big issue today, everybody talks about rights, and instead discuss privileges. And when you're dealing with loved ones, especially family members, there are many privileges that come with being a family member, and that privileges arise in conjunction with responsibilities. In this case, what's the responsibility? The responsibility is to take care of your health, to get yourself checked out. So there are many privileges that can be used, and this is a lot of what I counsel families about, because it's often when they get to they're at this point by the time they consult me. Privileges, and this is the most common scenario is an adult child who is clearly ill. So cell phone, computer and internet access, ability to have the car, gas or insurance, dollar subsidies, for spouses, making them meals, doing their laundry, going on vacations, and in the most extreme cases, and here you definitely need some counseling to pull this off, is to hold up residence and the relationship. Robert Frost said, home is the place where when you have to go there, they have to take you in. But on the other hand, Thomas Wolfe said you can't go home again, and sometimes that may actually be the last resort, that you may have to have the privilege of the roof. I'm just going to mention in one sentence here the fact that the ultimate situation when somebody, none of this is working, may be involuntary evaluation. And we have that in psychiatry. Typically, the circumstances in which that's allowed are very specific. It's when somebody is imminently in danger to themselves or others, imminently. That doesn't mean they might stab me if we go on too long. It's they held a knife and threatened to stab me, okay? And there's all sorts of ways of mobilizing authorities that now go beyond you. the authorities, the emergency room, the hospital, and I have in the book a whole algorithm, which I'm not going to go into here, just to show you the visual, about the various steps one takes in this kind of a situation. Emerson said, "It's one of the most beautiful compensations of this life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself." So you're going to need help. So, you know, the title of my book, You Need Help, is not just something you say to your loved one, but something that I'm saying to you, right? The reader, you need help, and it may require some counseling and support for you. We talked about the National Alliance on Mental Ill support groups, but the fact of the matter is one of the common things that I see in my work is people trying to do the right thing to be supportive for their loved one, particularly their very ill loved one, and they end up actually enabling the problem. Enabling. And remember that enabling is just is the same coin as love, right? Enabling always begins from a loving intent, wanting to do the right thing. But unfortunately, the way in which you're doing it ends up propagating, perhaps even elaborating the problem. And so a lot of the times in my counseling work with families, I have to address tenderly how they may actually be inadvertently enabling the problem. And then finally, I just throw this in for fun at the end, and that is that sometimes people are very influenced by celebrities and by famous people who have opened themselves up to treatment. I showed you Julie Andrews before, and sometimes you can point your loved one towards that. Oh, okay. So, for example, the Pope revealed that he consulted a psychiatrist to clarify a few things. Or this book that's just come out last month from Prince Harry. Prince Harry is all over the fact that he got therapy. And he said asking for help was one of the best decisions I ever made. And he actually, in his book tours and interviews, if you've watched him, he speaks very openly, very encouragingly about the value of professional help. Richard Nixon had a psychiatrist. And that was actually well known, and this psychiatrist, Dr. Arnold Hutschnecker, actually wrote about, I don't know how ethical it was that he wrote about that, but wrote about his treatment with Nixon. So the point is if a pope, a prince, and a president can get help or be helped by those who they love, so can you and your loved one. So finally, remember, as I said, this is an iterative process. You do not necessarily and typically don't succeed with the first try. What people think success looks like is on the left, but what it really looks like is on the right. So keep trying, don't give up. There are many, many tools in your toolbox. No tool is going to help you if it remains in the toolbox. Get the support that you need, the inspiration that you need, and you can accomplish this because so much depends on you more than it depends on me. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I think what we're going to do is going to take a 5-minute break so everybody can take a bathroom break, get a drink, and then my wife, Cantor Kim Komrad, having been stirred up by all of the ways in which the human mind can go wrong and how difficult it is, and many of you may already be having these kind of struggles, she is going to help us have some healing in a short healing service. Thank you. You saved the day.